The notice taped to my front door was bright orange and impossible to miss, which I suppose was the point when I trudged up my driveway after a 14-hour shift at the hospital in Anchorage, Alaska. I ripped it down and squinted at the bold letters that screamed about safety violations, improper storage of hazardous materials, and a fine of $500 payable within 10 business days. My name, Xavier Fordham, was printed at the top alongside my address on Snow Peak Drive in Eagle River, and below that, a description of my alleged crime, storing fuel for my snow machine in a manner inconsistent with community standards. I stood there in the February darkness, the orange paper trembling slightly in my gloved hand, and felt my blood pressure spike despite my exhaustion. The fuel tank they were talking about sat behind my house, properly installed by a licensed contractor, inspected by the fire marshal, and completely legal under every city, state, and federal regulation that existed. I had the permits in a folder in my office upstairs. I had done everything right because I was not the kind of person who cut corners, especially not with something as potentially dangerous as fuel storage. The signature at the bottom of the notice belonged to Barbara Hendricks, the president of the Snowridge Heights Homeowners Association. I had met her exactly twice since moving into this neighborhood 6 months ago. The first time was at the mandatory orientation meeting where she spent 45 minutes explaining the rules about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors, and acceptable holiday decorations. The second time was when she knocked on my door to inform me that my trash cans were visible from the street and needed to be moved behind my fence. Both encounters left me with the distinct impression that Barbara viewed her role as HOA president with the same gravity most people reserved for Supreme Court justices or military commanders. I unlocked my front door and stepped into the warmth of my house, pulling off my winter gear and tossing it onto the bench by the entrance. My golden retriever, Murphy, bounded over to greet me with his usual enthusiasm, and I scratched behind his ears while reading the notice again. The language was formal and threatening, citing section after section of the HOA bylaws that I was supposedly violating. According to Barbara's document, my fuel tank was an eyesore, a danger to the community, and grounds for progressive fines that would increase weekly until I removed it. I walked to my kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, then pulled out my phone and dialed the non-emergency line for the Eagle River Fire Department. It was late, but I knew the station operated around the clock. A dispatcher answered on the third ring. Eagle River Fire Department, how can I help you? Hi, my name is Xavier Fordham. I had a fuel storage tank installed at my residence about 4 months ago, and it was inspected and permitted by your department. I'm calling because my HOA just fined me for having it, and I want to confirm that my permit is still valid and that the installation meets all safety codes. The dispatcher asked for my address and put me on hold. I heard the faint sound of keyboard clicking and papers shuffling. After about 2 minutes, she came back on the line. Mr. Fordham, I'm showing that your permit for a 250-gallon above-ground fuel storage tank was issued on October 15th of last year. Our records indicate that Fire Marshal Thomas conducted the final inspection on October 23rd and signed off on it. Everything appears to be in order on our end. Can I get a copy of that inspection report and the permit? My HOA is claiming the tank is improper. Absolutely. You can come by the station anytime during business hours, or I can email you digital copies if you provide your email address. I gave her my email and thanked her. Within minutes, a PDF landed in my inbox with the official fire department seal at the top. I opened it on my phone, and scanned the details. Fire Marshal Thomas had not only approved my installation, but had written a note commending the quality of the work and the additional safety measures I had implemented, including a secondary containment system and a fire suppression system that exceeded minimum requirements. Armed with this documentation, I sat down at my kitchen table and drafted an email to Barbara Hendricks. I kept my tone professional but firm, explaining that my fuel tank was properly permitted, inspected, and compliant with all applicable laws. I attached the fire marshal's report and requested that the fine be rescinded immediately. I hit send at 11:30 that night and went to bed, assuming this would be the end of the matter. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke to 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail from Barbara herself. Her voice dripped with condescension as she explained that permits from the fire department did not override HOA rules, and that the covenants, conditions, and restrictions I had signed when purchasing my home gave the board authority over aesthetic and safety matters within the community. She concluded by informing me that if I did not remove the tank within 30 days, the fines would increase to $100 per day, and the HOA would pursue legal action. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the voicemail twice, and felt anger bubbling up in my chest. I had spent months researching fuel storage options before installing the tank. Living in Alaska meant relying on snow machines for recreation, and sometimes for transportation during heavy snowfall. Running out of fuel was not just an inconvenience, it could be dangerous. My tank allowed me to buy fuel in bulk during the summer when prices were lower, and ensured I always had access when I needed it. More importantly, I had checked the HOA bylaws before installation. There was no specific prohibition against fuel storage tanks. The sections Barbara cited in her notice were vague catch-all clauses about maintaining property values and preventing nuisances. I knew from my years of dealing with hospital administrators that vague rules were often used as weapons by petty bureaucrats who wanted to flex their authority. I showered, dressed, and made coffee, then called a lawyer. Her name was Jennifer Kwan, and she specialized in real estate and HOA disputes. Her office was in Anchorage, and I had gotten her name from a colleague who had fought his own HOA over a fence dispute. Jennifer answered on the second ring, and I explained my situation in detail. "Did you review the CC and Articus before installing the tank?" she asked. "Yes, there's nothing specifically prohibiting it. Barbara is using general language about nuisances and property values." "And you have the fire marshal's approval, signed, sealed, and delivered. The tank exceeds safety standards." Jennifer was quiet for a moment. I heard her typing in the background. "Okay, here's the thing. HOAs in Alaska have broad authority, but they're not above state and local laws. If your tank is legally permitted and complies with fire codes, the HOA can't force you to remove it just because they don't like how it looks. However, they can make your life difficult with fines and legal threats. My recommendation is to respond formally, assert your rights, and be prepared to fight this if they escalate." "How much is this going to cost me?" "My retainer is $1,500. If this goes to litigation, it could be more, but most of these cases settle before trial. HOAs hate bad publicity, and they hate losing even more." I hired her on the spot and felt a small measure of relief. At least I had someone in my corner who understood the law. Jennifer said she would draft a formal response to Barbara and the HOA board, demanding they rescind the fine and cease their harassment. That afternoon, I went to the fire station to meet Fire Marshal Thomas in person. He was a stocky man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard and a friendly demeanor. We sat in his small office, surrounded by filing cabinets and safety posters, and I showed him the HOA notice. "This is ridiculous," he said, shaking his head. "Your tank is one of the best installations I've seen in this area. You went above and beyond what's required. I can't believe they're giving you grief over this. Can you write a letter or something official that I can present to the HOA? Something that makes it clear this tank is safe and legal?" Thomas nodded. "I'll do you one better. I'll attend your next HOA meeting if you want. Sometimes these board members need to hear from an authority figure before they back down." I thanked him and left the station feeling slightly more optimistic, but that optimism was short-lived. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Gregory Dalton. The letter reiterated the demand to remove my fuel tank and added new accusations. According to Dalton, the tank was not only unsightly but also posed a risk to neighboring properties. He claimed that several residents had complained about the smell of fuel and feared an explosion. The letter concluded with a threat to place a lien on my property if I did not comply. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling my frustration grow. The accusations were absurd. My tank was behind my house, not visible from the street, and the fuel was stored in a sealed system that did not emit odors. The explosion claim was pure fear-mongering. Fire Marshal Thomas had confirmed that my safety measures exceeded industry standards. Jennifer reviewed the letter and responded swiftly. She pointed out that the HOA had not provided evidence of any complaints, that the tank was legal, and that threatening a lien over a compliant installation was improper. She also requested copies of the bylaws and any records of complaints from neighbors. The HOA ignored her request. Meanwhile, I started receiving cold stares from some of my neighbors. One morning, as I was loading my Snowmachine onto its trailer, the woman who lived 2 doors down walked past and muttered something about irresponsible people endangering the neighborhood. I tried to talk to her, to explain that my tank was safe, but she hurried away without making eye contact. Barbara, it seemed, had been spreading rumors. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I printed copies of the fire marshal's report and my permits, along with a letter explaining the situation, and hand-delivered them to every house on my street. Most people were polite and thanked me for the information. A few seemed genuinely surprised that there was a fuel tank on my property at all, which proved that it was not the eyesore Barbara claimed it to be, but not everyone was receptive. One man, a retiree named Gerald, told me flat out that he trusted Barbara's judgment and that I should just follow the rules like everyone else. When I pointed out that I was following the rules, that I had permits and inspections proving my compliance, he shrugged and said the HOA knew best. That attitude was baffling to me. I had always believed in following rules, but I also believed that rules had to be fair and based on logic. Barbara's crusade against my fuel tank was neither. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday in March. Jennifer advised me to attend and to bring Fire Marshal Thomas if he was still willing. I called Thomas, and he confirmed he would be there. I also prepared a short presentation with photos of my tank, copies of my permits, and a summary of the safety features I had installed. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, the parking lot was nearly full. I recognized most of the cars as belonging to my neighbors. Inside, rows of folding chairs faced a table at the front where Barbara and 4 other board members sat. Barbara spotted me immediately, and her expression hardened. I took a seat near the back, and Fire Marshal Thomas arrived a few minutes later. He sat beside me, and we waited while Barbara called the meeting to order. She started with routine business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing upcoming maintenance projects, and reminding everyone about the community garage sale in April. Finally, she reached the topic I had been waiting for. "We have a matter of non-compliance to address," Barbara said, her voice sharp. "Mr. Fordham has installed a large fuel storage tank on his property without HOA approval. Despite being fined, he has refused to remove it. This is a violation of our community standards and poses a safety risk." A murmur went through the room. I raised my hand, and Barbara reluctantly acknowledged me. "I'd like to address this," I said, standing up. "I have documentation proving that my fuel tank is properly permitted, inspected, and compliant with all safety codes. I also have Fire Marshal Thomas here, who can speak to the safety of my installation." Barbara's face flushed. "This is not a debate, Mr. Fordham. The HOA has rules, and you agreed to follow them when you bought your home." "I did follow them," I said evenly. "There's nothing in the CC and Articus that prohibits fuel storage tanks." One of the other board members, a younger man named Kevin, leaned forward. "The bylaws give us discretion to address issues that affect property values and community safety." "That discretion isn't unlimited," I replied. "State law and fire codes supersede HOA rules. My tank is legal and you can't force me to remove it." Fire Marshal Thomas stood up. "If I may," he said. "I'm Thomas, the fire marshal for Eagle River. I personally inspected Mr. Fordham's fuel tank, and it's one of the best installations I've seen. It exceeds all safety requirements. There's no risk to this community." Barbara looked flustered. "With all due respect, Marshal, this isn't just about safety. It's about maintaining the character of our neighborhood. Large industrial tanks don't belong in a residential area." "It's not industrial," I interjected. "It's a standard residential tank. And it's behind my house, not visible from the street." Another board member, an older woman named Deanne, spoke up. "Several residents have complained about the smell." "That's impossible," Thomas said. "The tank is sealed. There's no way it's emitting odors. Are you calling our residents liars?" Barbara snapped. "I'm saying they're mistaken," Thomas replied calmly. "Or they're smelling something else entirely." The meeting devolved into chaos. Some neighbors supported me, pointing out that my tank was legal and that the HOA was overstepping. Others sided with Barbara, insisting that rules were rules and that I should just comply. Barbara tried to regain control, but the room was too noisy. Finally, Kevin proposed a motion to table the discussion and hire an independent inspector to evaluate the tank. The motion passed, and Barbara announced that I would be responsible for paying for the inspection. I objected, but the board voted against me. As the meeting adjourned, Barbara approached me. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "If you just remove the tank, this all goes away." "I'm not removing a legally permitted safe installation because you don't like it," I said. "Then you'll keep paying fines," she said coldly. "And we'll keep fighting you. You can't win against the board." I left the meeting angry but not defeated. Jennifer filed a formal complaint with the Alaska Real Estate Commission, arguing that the HOA was acting improperly. She also prepared a motion for an injunction to stop the fines while the matter was under review. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. The HOA hired an inspector who confirmed that my tank met all safety standards but noted that it was visually intrusive when viewed from certain angles. Barbara used this vague finding to justify continuing the fines. My account with the HOA now showed over $2,000 in penalties. I refused to pay. Jennifer filed the injunction, and a hearing was scheduled in Anchorage Superior Court. Meanwhile, I started digging into the HOA's history. I requested financial records, board meeting minutes, and copies of all enforcement actions taken over the past 5 years. What I found was eye-opening. Barbara had been president for 3 years, and during that time, the HOA had fined residents for a staggering array of minor infractions. People had been penalized for leaving their garage doors open, parking in their driveways overnight, and displaying unapproved lawn ornaments. In every case, Barbara had pushed for maximum penalties, and the board had rubber-stamped her decisions. More disturbing, I discovered that Barbara's own property was in violation of several bylaws. Her fence exceeded the permitted height, her shed was unpainted and weathered, and her driveway was cracked and unkempt. Yet there was no record of her ever being fined. I brought this information to Jennifer, who was delighted. "This is exactly what we need," she said. "It shows selective enforcement, which is a big no-no for HOAs. If they're enforcing rules against you but not against board members, that's grounds for dismissing the fines and possibly even suing for damages." At the injunction hearing, Jennifer presented my case with precision. She showed the fire marshal's report, the permits, and the inspector's confirmation that my tank was safe. She also highlighted the selective enforcement, pointing out Barbara's violations and the HOA's failure to hold her accountable. The HOA's attorney, Gregory Dalton, argued that the board had broad discretion and that my tank was unsightly. He claimed that the complaints from neighbors justified the fines, and that my refusal to comply showed a disregard for community standards. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nguyen, listened to both sides and asked pointed questions. When Dalton claimed the tank was a safety risk, Judge Nguyen asked why the fire marshal had approved it. When Barbara tried to speak out of turn, the judge silenced her with a look. After an hour of arguments, Judge Nguyen issued her ruling. She granted the injunction, halting all fines against me. She also ordered the HOA to provide evidence of the complaints they claimed to have received and to explain why Barbara's property was not being held to the same standards as mine. "This court will not tolerate selective enforcement," Judge Nguyen said. "If the HOA wants to enforce rules, it must do so fairly and consistently. Mr. Fordham has demonstrated that his fuel tank is legal and safe. Until the board can provide compelling evidence to the contrary, the fines are suspended." I left the courthouse feeling vindicated. Jennifer was grinning. "That was beautiful," she said. "Barbara didn't know what hit her, but Barbara was not done." Over the next month, she held emergency board meetings and sent out newsletters to the community, painting me as a troublemaker who was undermining the HOA. She claimed that my lawsuit was costing the association thousands of dollars in legal fees and that all residents would see their dues increase as a result. Some neighbors bought into her narrative. I received angry emails and even a nasty note left on my windshield. But others reached out to thank me. One couple, who had been fined for replacing their mailbox without approval, said they were inspired to fight back. The tide started to turn when a local news station picked up the story. A reporter named Lisa Cho contacted me after hearing about the case from a friend of hers who lived in my neighborhood. I agreed to an interview, and Lisa came to my house with a camera crew. We stood by my fuel tank while I explained the situation. Fire Marshal Thomas also gave an interview, reiterating that the tank was safe. Lisa even spoke to some of my neighbors, including the couple who had been fined over their mailbox. The story aired on the evening news, and the response was overwhelming. Suddenly, the HOA was under scrutiny. People from other neighborhoods shared their own stories of abusive HOA boards. A state legislator even commented on social media, calling for reforms to HOA laws in Alaska. Barbara tried to control the damage by issuing a statement claiming the news report was biased and that the board was simply trying to protect the community. But the damage was done. At the next HOA meeting, attendance was the highest it had been in years, and most of the people there were angry. One by one, residents stood up and shared their grievances. A man named Philip described being fined for painting his house a shade of beige that was supposedly not on the approved list, even though it looked identical to his neighbor's house. A woman named Sandra talked about being threatened with a lien for planting flowers in her front yard without permission. Barbara tried to defend herself, but the room was hostile. Kevin and Deanne, the other board members, sat quietly, clearly uncomfortable. Finally, a resident named Marco stood up and made a motion to remove Barbara from the board. The motion was seconded and a vote was called. Of the 63 people in attendance, 51 voted in favor of removing her. Barbara's face turned red. "You can't do this," she said. "I'm elected by the board, not by the residents." "Actually, the bylaws allow for a recall vote if a majority of residents support it," Marco said. He was a lawyer himself, and he had clearly done his homework. Barbara stormed out of the meeting, and the room erupted in applause. Kevin was elected interim president, and he immediately announced that the board would review all outstanding fines and enforcement actions. A week later, I received a letter from the HOA formally rescinding my fines and apologizing for the inconvenience. Kevin called me personally to express his regret over how the situation had been handled. He also mentioned that the board was considering updating the bylaws to include clearer language about fuel storage and other contentious issues. I appreciated the apology, but I was not ready to let the matter drop entirely. Jennifer and I discussed filing a lawsuit against Barbara personally for harassment and abuse of power. We had evidence that she had spread false information about me, including the baseless claims about fuel odors and explosion risks. Before we could proceed, however, something unexpected happened. The Alaska Real Estate Commission launched an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. It turned out that several residents had filed complaints about missing funds and questionable expenditures. The investigation uncovered that Barbara had been using HOA money for personal expenses. She had charged the association for landscaping work at her own home, claiming it was for common areas. She had also paid herself an unauthorized salary for her role as president. In total, she had misappropriated over $15,000. When the findings were made public, Barbara was arrested. The charges included theft and embezzlement. Her mugshot appeared on the local news, and the story went viral. People who had defended her were mortified, and those she had bullied felt vindicated. The HOA's insurance covered most of the missing funds, but the scandal left a lasting mark on the community. Kevin and the new board worked hard to rebuild trust, and they implemented a series of reforms, including term limits for board members and greater transparency in financial matters. As for me, I finally felt like I could relax. My fuel tank remained in place, fully legal and properly permitted. I continued to use my Snowmachine for weekend trips into the backcountry, and every time I filled up from my tank, I thought about the absurdity of the fight I had been forced to endure. Murphy and I took a long ride one Saturday morning in late April, the sun bright and the snow still thick in the mountains. The air was crisp, and the landscape was breathtaking. Out there, far from HOA meetings and petty disputes, I felt at peace. When I returned home that evening, I found a handmade card in my mailbox. It was from Sandra, the woman who had been fined for planting flowers. Inside, she had written a simple message. "Thank you for standing up to Barbara. You inspired a lot of us." I smiled and tucked the card into my jacket pocket. Fighting the HOA had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it. Sometimes standing up for what was right meant enduring harassment, spending money on lawyers, and dealing with people who saw authority as an excuse to control others. But in the end, truth and fairness had prevailed. Barbara was facing criminal charges, the HOA was under new leadership, and my fuel tank sat behind my house, a quiet testament to the fact that rules meant nothing if they were not applied justly. Over the following months, life in Snowridge Heights gradually returned to normal. Kevin proved to be a fair and reasonable president, and he made it a priority to reach out to residents who had been wronged during Barbara's tenure. Several fines were rescinded, and the board issued formal apologies to those who had been treated unfairly. I stayed involved in HOA matters, attending meetings and serving on a committee to revise the bylaws. It was tedious work, but I wanted to ensure that future residents would not have to go through what I had experienced. We added specific language about permitted structures, clarified the enforcement process, and included provisions for appealing board decisions. Jennifer helped draft the new bylaws, and they were approved unanimously at a special meeting in June. The changes were modest but important, and they represented a shift toward transparency and accountability. Barbara's criminal trial took place in August. I attended the proceedings along with several other residents. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her embezzlement, including bank records, invoices, and testimony from contractors who had been paid with HOA funds for work at her home. Barbara's defense attorney tried to argue that the expenditures were legitimate and that she had been acting in the best interest of the community, but the argument fell flat. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Nguyen, the same judge who had presided over my injunction hearing, sentenced Barbara to 18 months in prison and ordered her to pay restitution to the HOA. As the bailiff led her away, Barbara glanced back at the courtroom with a look of defiance that quickly crumbled into resignation. Outside the courthouse, several of us gathered to talk. Marco, the lawyer who had initiated the recall vote, shook my hand. "You started this," he said. "If you hadn't fought back, Barbara would still be running the HOA like her personal fiefdom." "I just wanted to keep my fuel tank," I said with a laugh. "Well, you did more than that," Sandra added. "You gave the rest of us the courage to speak up." We went out for dinner that night, a small group of neighbors who had bonded over our shared frustration with the old board. It felt good to be part of a community again, to know that we were working together to make things better. As summer turned to fall, I focused on my work at the hospital and enjoyed the Alaskan outdoors. My snow machine was ready for the winter season, and my fuel tank was full. I had even added a small sign on the tank that read, "Inspected and approved by Eagle River Fire Department," just in case anyone had any lingering doubts. One evening in September, I was out in my yard with Murphy when Kevin stopped by. He had a manila folder in his hand and a sheepish expression on his face. "Hey, Xavier," he said. "Got a minute?" "Sure." "What's up?" Kevin handed me the folder. "We found some old records in Barbara's files. Turns out she had a personal vendetta against you." I opened the folder and skimmed the contents. Inside were printed emails between Barbara and Gregory Dalton, the HOA's former attorney. In the emails, Barbara described me as a troublemaker and instructed Dalton to make an example of me. She also mentioned that she disliked me because I had not attended enough HOA events and had questioned her authority during my first orientation meeting. "This is insane," I said. She went after me just because I didn't kiss the ring, Kevin nodded. It looks that way. I wanted you to know so you'd have the full picture. If you want to pursue any kind of legal action for harassment, these emails could help. I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. Barbara's already in prison, and the HOA has moved on. I don't see the point in dragging this out any further. Kevin looked relieved. I was hoping you'd say that. The new board is trying to put all of this behind us, and your attitude has been a big help. We chatted for a few more minutes, and then Kevin left. I stood in my yard, watching the sun dip below the mountains, and felt a sense of closure. The fight with the HOA had been one of the most stressful experiences of my life, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about resilience, community, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Winter arrived early that year, and the first major snowfall came in late October. I took my snow machine out on the first clear day, riding through the backcountry trails with Murphy running alongside for as long as he could keep up. The world was white and silent, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the crunch of snow beneath the treads. I stopped at a ridgeline and looked back toward Eagle River. From this distance, the town was just a cluster of lights against the dark landscape. My house was somewhere in that cluster, a small piece of property that I had fought hard to keep on my own terms. As I sat there, I thought about Barbara and the way she had wielded her authority like a weapon. I thought about the neighbors who had suffered under her rule and the ones who had found their voices and fought back. And I thought about the importance of laws and regulations, not as tools for control, but as frameworks for fairness and justice. The fuel tank saga had started as a simple dispute over property rights, but it had become something much bigger. It had exposed the flaws in the HOA system, brought a community together, and ultimately led to meaningful change. I rode back home as the sun set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. Murphy was waiting for me in the yard, his tail wagging furiously. I parked the snow machine, refilled its tank from my storage system, and went inside to warm up. That night, I received an email from Jennifer. She was checking in to see how things were going, and to let me know that she had been contacted by several other HOA victims who wanted her help. She joked that my case had turned her into the go-to lawyer for HOA disputes in Alaska. I wrote back, thanking her for everything she had done and wishing her luck with her new clients. Then I closed my laptop and poured myself a glass of whiskey. I sat by the window, watching the snow fall gently outside, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight was over. The tank was staying, and Barbara Hendricks was exactly where she deserved to be. Over the next year, life in Snow Ridge Heights continued to improve. The new board was responsive and reasonable, and the community felt more cohesive than it had in years. People organized block parties, started a neighborhood watch program, and even launched a community garden project. I became friends with many of my neighbors, including Marco, Sandra, and Philip. We often joked about the Barbara era and marveled at how much had changed. The revised bylaws were working well, and there had been no major disputes since Kevin took over as president. In February, exactly 1 year after the orange notice had appeared on my door, Kevin organized a small celebration at the clubhouse. He called it a community renewal event, and it was a chance for everyone to reflect on how far we had come. During the event, Kevin gave a short speech. He thanked everyone who had stood up to Barbara and acknowledged the role I had played in exposing her misconduct. Then he presented me with a plaque that read, "To Xavier Fordham for his courage and integrity in defending what was right." I accepted the plaque with gratitude, though I felt slightly embarrassed by the attention. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I didn't set out to be a hero. I said. "I just wanted to keep my fuel tank." But along the way, I learned that fighting for what's right isn't just about winning. It's about showing others that they have a voice too. Thank you all for supporting me and for making this community a better place. The room erupted in applause, and I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey I was drinking. As the celebration wound down, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were brilliant overhead. Fire Marshal Thomas had attended the event and he joined me outside. "How's the tank holding up?" he asked with a grin. "Perfect," I said. "Not a single issue." "Good. You know, your case actually inspired some changes at the state level. There's a bill in the legislature right now that would limit HOA authority over legally permitted structures. If it passes, what happened to you won't happen to anyone else." I was stunned. "Seriously?" Thomas nodded. "Your story got people's attention." Sometimes it takes one person standing up to create real change. We stood there in silence for a moment, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The ordeal with Barbara and the HOA had been painful, but it had also been meaningful. It had brought people together, exposed corruption, and potentially led to reforms that would protect others. Murphy was inside the clubhouse, charming the guests and begging for scraps. I went back in to retrieve him, said my goodbyes, and headed home. The streets were quiet, and the snow crunched softly under my boots. When I reached my house, I paused by the fuel tank. It sat exactly where it had always been, solid and unassuming. I ran my hand along the cold metal and thought about everything it represented: the fight for justice, the importance of standing your ground, and the power of community. Inside, I poured another glass of whiskey and sat by the fireplace. Murphy curled up at my feet and I stared into the flames, reflecting on the past year. Barbara was serving her sentence, the HOA was thriving, and my tank was exactly where it belonged. The ordeal had tested me in ways I had not anticipated, but it had also shown me that ordinary people could stand up to bullies and win. As I sat there, I thought about the future. The proposed legislation Thomas had mentioned would be a game changer for HOA residents across Alaska. If it passed, it would serve as a reminder that property rights mattered and that no organization, no matter how powerful, was above the law. I raised my glass in a silent toast to Fire Marshal Thomas, to Jennifer, to Kevin and the new board, and to all the neighbors who had found their voices and demanded change. Then I drained the glass, set it on the table, and leaned back in my chair. Murphy stirred slightly, then settled back into sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and swirling the snow, but inside, everything was warm and still. The fight was over and I had won. Not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA or told that rules mattered more than fairness. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a deep sense of peace. The fuel tank would remain, a quiet monument to the importance of standing up for what was right. And I would continue to live my life on my own terms, in a community that had learned the hard way that justice and accountability were worth fighting for. The story of the fuel tank had started with an orange notice and a petty tyrant. But it had ended with a community transformed, a criminal brought to justice, and a man who had learned that sometimes the smallest battles could lead to the biggest victories. And that, I thought as sleep overtook me, was worth every moment of the fight.